This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air. Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. This episode, okay y'all, I have been wanting to break down this moment ever since I saw it just all over my TikTok, and I'm like, this would be so good to break down on the podcast. I honestly cannot believe that this moment happened in an interview in 2025. Like, it actually is so unreal. But also, when you really think about it, it's actually not that surprising. And so if you're like, okay, well, what is this moment? Like, you've got me on the edge of my seat. What's going on? Hold on, I'm going to tell y'all. So, during the Venice International Film Festival, hella celebrities, hella movies, hella interviews. And there was this particular interview for the movie After the Hunt, and the interview had Julia Roberts, Andrew Garfield, and Ayo Edebiri. And I actually, even just retelling this, I'm like, I actually cannot believe that this happened. So the interviewer in question, Frederica Polidoro, for the Arts Life TV / Italian Press, she said, and I quote, "What have we lost during the politically correct era, and what do we have to expect in Hollywood after the Me Too movement and Black Lives movement are done?" And before she said that, she specifically said with her chest, this question was for Julia and Andrew alone, notably excluding Ayo from the question. And actually, I encourage y'all to go try and get footage of this, because as soon as that question is said, you can just see Andrew immediately turns around. Like, everyone has that look of shock on their face, but Andrew turns around and it's very much giving the energy of like, I'm so shocked, but I'm going to let the adults in the room deal with this. And then Julia Roberts, and you could tell that she is so media trained, because the way that she said this, you could really tell that she was asking, I'm going to give you a chance to correct yourself. She looks at the interviewer, she looks at Frederica, and she's like, you've got your sunglasses on. I can't really tell which of us who you're talking to. Like, could you say that again? And that was very much her opportunity to correct herself. But again, all 10 toes, standing on business, she repeated that question. And she said with her chest again, this is for Julia and Andrew. Oh my days, y'all. Oh my days. And fair enough, Ayo is looking bamboozled, shocked, confused, because how are you, A, saying that the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement are done? And how are you excluding the black female from that question? But I was like, I know that question is not for me, and I don't know if it's purposeful that it's not for me, but I am just curious. I don't think it's done. I don't think it's done at all. And then she went on to say, maybe hashtags might not be used as much, but there's work being done by activists, by people every day. Like, that work is not finished at all. And Andrew and Julia, they, backed Ayo up and, were saying, like, their work is not finished, is absolutely alive, maybe not as labelled or covered or magnified as much in this present moment, but their work is not done. This moment was just everywhere, and I think there's a lot to talk about here, but let's get into what happened after the interview. So the interviewer Frederica, put a statement on Instagram later. Again, Homegirl stands on business defending her phrasing. And then, she denied any accusations of racism, and she called she was calling the critics' behavior, labeling it as cyberbullying them and accusing them of wanting to muzzle journalism. And she also said that she has interviewed people of every background and ethnicity, and there's no established protocol saying how interview questions must be directed. I don't know. It doesn't make it any better, does it? And then critics then went on to, have something to say about her quote-unquote defense, because they were like, girl, where's the accountability? And I think what makes it particularly sting is that, she's saying that, she's interviewed people of every background and ethnicity, and there's no established protocol how interview questions must be directed. But the facts of the matter is that there was a question that concerned race and gender, and she excluded the person who, that topic was the most relevant. In late, the press for the movie was still happening, and I was asked about that particular moment. And I was just saying, it was a very human moment, and use that as an opportunity to kind of link it to the theme of the movie. And I think when you understand or realize what the theme of the movie is, you can just add this to the list of why the question was so wild. The list is long, don't get me wrong, but this is definitely a big reason. So the movie After the Hunt is about Alma, who is played by Julia Roberts, a philosophy professor at Yale, whose, whole world gets shaken up when her amazing A++ star student Nagy, played by Ayo, accuses Alma's colleague of sexual assault, and the close colleague is played by Andrew. And so, this whole accusation, it's kind of opens up the door to this huge web of secrets and loyalty and doubt and institutional pressures, and really asking those foundational deep questions, and opening that conversation around consent and power and voice. I haven't watched the movie at all, but just a quick look at the reviews. The reviews say it's, leaning into some really big ideas. It's ambiguous. It's provocative. And some other critics said it was just muddled and lacking focus. So it seems like there's a mixed response to the movie itself. But I think, regardless of what the critics said or how you feel about the movie, the fact that the key themes are about consent, power, and voice, and you have the character in the movie, a black female, saying hey, this is what's happened to me, and to then exclude that same actress from a question that directly speaks to the themes of the movie, which is, it is insane, right? Because the themes of the movie, it directly speaks to the Me Too movement and the questions that are asked there of how institutions, they are enablers and often enforce that silence or complicity, and how the narratives of harm or trauma are dealt with, how they're contested or consumed, and how, you know, the power dynamics have a role to play in this as well. And so I think, you know, I haven't seen that movie, but if, you know, art mimics life, I'm assuming that that A++ star student, Maggie, played by Ayo, is probably questioned and not believed and dismissed. And that is exactly what happened in that interview, which, again, you know, art mimicking life. And I feel like, isn't that so, like, validating to that director and the script writers and just everyone involved in the movie that had to happen? It just shows that this is not just artistic exploration of consent, power, and voice. It very much is opening the door on something that happens in real life. It's a pattern that's being upheld. And so it is just very wild, you know, when the movie is kind of opening the door or inviting conversations around credibility and sexual harm and institutional complicity and who is believed, that the way that question was asked and who it was directed to and who was excluded from that question, it's like some kind of meta commentary, meta life moment happening, because it exactly highlights the point of what the film is trying to do. It was just absolutely wild. So I really wanted to use this episode to talk about the erasure of voices, and how, in my opinion, the phrasing, you know, what we have lost during the politically correct era, I think how that links up to the very extreme and like binary thinking we have nowadays. So yeah, let's get into it. But before we get into it, y'all, if you have not seen this interview moment, look, I would 100% recommend that you go watch the Audacity for yourself. But I actually, and also people on the internet, I love how unserious and serious people are. Like the comments around Julia asking her to take off her sunglasses cracks me up. Like the comments are like, if a Southern woman is asking you to take your sunglasses off, like they are not playing. That is your chance to fix yourself. I don't know. People on the internet, so serious and unserious at the same time. It absolutely cracks me up. And I also, before we really get into it, I just kind of want to highlight similar moments that this interview had, because I really want to highlight this is not just like a one-off thing. Like this is very much a pattern. And all of the examples that I have are, in pop culture. But I'm sure if you get personal with it, that there are many personal examples in your own lived world that would come up as well. So remember back in 2016, and side note, y'all, I don't know why the internet is romanticizing 2016 at the moment. I don't know, 2025 is treating us all rough if we're, I think, romanticizing 2016. But anyways, let's cast our minds back to almost 10 years ago, my Lord. And there was that hashtag where it was hashtag Oscars so white, and there was a huge controversy over the lack of black nominees. And then all of the interviews around that time were asking white actors to talk about diversity, while the black actors were just skipped straight up, or just given questions that were I don't know, they just reinforce a lot of tokenization. Like, for example, Viola Davis and Ava DuVernay were only ever really asked about diversity, not their craft, while, you know, white actors were asked to weigh in on systemic racism. And it's just wild because the people who are most implicated are not like centered as like legitimate experts on systemic racism, or like, you know, just even that lived experience is not being centered at all. It's being dismissed, which is absolutely wild. And that's exactly what happened when, you know, that interview was very purposeful and only directing that question to Andrew and Julia. And then we had, you know, the 2020 VP debate, and, you know, Kamala Harris being the first Black woman and South Asian woman of the stage was always interrupted by Mike Pence, and she literally had to be like, I am speaking. And I think the reason why that clip went so viral of Kamala being like, I'm speaking, it just, you know, it just highlights how women of color really need to assert their right to speak. And you see this all the time in spaces that, you know, sideline anyone who's marginalized. And I think that also kind of echoes what happened in this interview where Ayo at Homegirl did it in such a classy way. Oh, she is a woman I aspire to be. What an amazing woman. But she just was like, you know, I know that that's not for me, but, you know, I'm curious. Another example, Serena Williams, and this has happened time and time again, that you cannot ignore this pattern. But Serena Williams often gets questions unrelated to her craft, and like a lot of the times the reporters skip over her achievements, which is wild, and then just ask like really stupid, silly questions. Like, we cannot forget the infamous, again, 2016 interview where she was asked why she's not smiling or why she's not more friendly. Do you see any male tennis stars being asked the same thing? Hell no. These male athletes are asked about their skills and not asked stupid questions like that. So again, just add that to the pattern. Another thing that we can add to the pattern, and this is back in the 1960s, 70s, Nina Simone was often asked about her anger or politics rather than her artistry, where, you know, white artists are around the same time were really, you know, asked a lot of questions about their music and their craft. And I think it just, and like Nina's, I love how I say Nina by first name as if I personally, you know, we're homies. But anyways, Nina's responses kind of highlights that absurdity of being expected to depoliticize her voice as a Black woman. And I, you know, that's enough said there. And then we have, Toni Morrison. So Toni was often asked to simplify her work for white audiences or to answer questions about quote unquote universal themes, which, you know, quote unquote is really coded for talking about, you know, white experiences. And then Oprah, our girl Oprah, upheld this pattern. And this just goes to show that, you know, this is what I mean when I'm talking about all of these things being a system or a school of thought. It doesn't particularly pertain to a particular community of people. Like this, if it's a way of thinking, if it's a system, it can be absorbed by anyone, regardless of their identity, or regardless if their identities are kind of could be marginalized or hurt by the system. It just goes to show that the system and the school of thought and the stories that the system upholds can be absorbed by anyone. And I think, not to get real deep with it, but I am going to get real deep with it. Oprah is a particularly interesting example because, yes, she is a Black woman. And so there are things that she would have on her rise to the top, that her being a Black woman, there would have been some things that she would have experienced, like barriers that she would have experienced specifically because she is a Black woman, that would have made things harder for her. But, now she's on top, and, she is so successful. I think when you reach that, specifically that tax bracket and that level of clout, like, I don't like the Venn diagram between Oprah Winfrey and other Black women. That Venn diagram, the overlap is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where it's just maybe a little slice, like it's not the same Venn diagram as Oprah Winfrey when she was coming up or earlier on in her life. And then that kind of goes to show, because for Oprah to ask this question, it says a lot. So when Oprah Winfrey was interviewing Tony, she was saying, like, your writing is so rich and challenging that some readers felt left out. And the queen that Toni Morrison is, homegirl just said, that's okay, they should work a little harder. And I think that speaks volumes. Like, the things that Toni writes about, it's very much the Black experience, and writing about Blackness, and for readers to feel left out, it just goes to show that we should work harder to embrace hearing voices and stories that aren't the norm, in the sense that this is what the system has historically prioritizes now. And so, this pattern is, for the interviewer to behave the way that they did, it's not on purpose. It is very much a pattern. One thing that I really wanted to talk about as well, and add this to the list of like reasons why this interview was so wild, is that when you think, it's wild because, well, you've excluded a Black female from a question that included Me Too, Black Lives Matter. It's wild knowing the plot of the movie and for that interview to happen the way that it did. It's wild because this is just another example of a pattern and a system that is being upheld. But I think another reason why this is so wild is when you think about, the movements that the interviewer mentioned, the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, it just shows like how Black women are erased from narratives, because, the Me Too movement, it is associated with that viral moment back in 2017 with Alyssa Milano, especially after the Harvey Weinstein revelations. But it's often forgotten about that the movement started in 2006 by a Black woman called Tarana book to talk about the sexual violence in marginalized communities. And, there was that mainstream attention in 2017, but it was interesting, since 2017 to now, the erasure of the work that Tarana Burke has done. And that was even, that erasure was quite obvious as well when it did become mainstream, because the media often favoured white women's stories, especially in the Hollywood context, over those of, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, immigrant, disabled, poor women, that intersectionality. It was not there. It was just not there. And for the Black Lives Matter movement, well, that speaks for itself, that it was founded by 3 Black women, Patrisse Cullors, Elisa Gaza, and Opal Tometi, back in 2013, in response to the acquittals and the killings of Black men. And I think it's interesting over the years seeing the response to the Black Lives Matter movement, because I think the same pattern of erasure of Black voices has happened as well. Even the fact that there's a phrase that's all lives matter, that completely erases the Black struggle. And so when you have that history behind those movements, and then to have those movements brought up in that question and to not include Ayo in that question is wild. And you do see erasure of Black women in a different context. Mainstream media often centers white women's stories in Me Too, while sexual violence against Black women gets less attention. And even within the Black Lives Matter context and the leadership and the frontline activism, that is often overshadowed by male leaders in the public face. And this just goes to show that there's two identities that can't be isolated, but amplify how the level of depthness this erasure of voice affects there's that double oppression, and so in Bell Hooks' book Ain't I a Woman, Bell Hooks argued that Black women have historically been doubly oppressed by racism and by sexism, and so are marginalized within both the Black liberation and feminist spaces. And I think that example before about within the Black Lives Matter movement, that, Black women are often overshadowed by male leaders. It just goes to show that it's that interplay between being Black and a woman. And you can see how those two systems, racism and sexism, interact with each other. And I think that intersectionality is clearly not understood, because if you think about our legal, social, political, institutional structures, how they often fail to capture, to acknowledge the overlapping harms that Black women face, it says a lot. There's that understanding of intersectionality is not there. So, Black women are present, physically, for lack of a better word, conceptually, but often invisible in narratives of social justice, minimized in prominence, and or only asked to do anything or to step up or have their voices acknowledged when it's safe or when it's tokenized. And yeah, I think that the fact that this is all still so relevant in 2025 is absolutely wild. absolutely wild. And when you think about like that interview now with this context, it just makes it even more audacious as well. And I think when you think about the interviewers, like their, I wouldn't even call it an apology, but, you know, whatever their response was, it just really falls flat when you are talking about it in this context. Because, you know, to say critics are just merely cyberbullying and want to muzzle journalism. And you hear that a lot these days of like, well, our freedom of speech is being infringed upon. And then kind of defending her position by saying, you know, like, I've interviewed people of every background, ethnicity, and there's no established protocol how interview questions must be directed. It absolutely falls flat. And just to like further reinforce the like erasure of Black women, you know, in film industry studies, women of color, particularly Black women, are underrepresented in lead roles, behind the scenes roles, and also voice and publicity campaigns. In media coverage, stories of sexual violence or race are more likely to feature white victims, or, you know, and I'm using air quotes even though you can't see me, but exceptional Black victims. And that then kind of reinforces or perpetuates stereotypes about whose pain is visible. In the academia world, the intellectual labor of Black women is often quoted but minimized, or the ideas are passed off to someone else without any form of credit, often in panels or boards or talk shows. You know, Black women serve as tokens but not as equals in discourse. And yeah, I think just going back to Bell Hooks, you know, Bell Hooks really emphasized that Black women face multiple layers of oppression and are often discounted in feminist and anti-racist movements. And I think, yeah, Bell Hooks has also been quite critical of mainstream feminism, which has historically centered white women and, you know, completely ignores class, race, and the lived experiences of Black women. And the person who developed the like concept of intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, the Crenshaw, you know, said like, you know, for lack of a better word, categories like woman or Black person, they are insufficient on their own. Like, you can't separate it like that, because the interplay between woman and Black person is important, because it's not that Black women's experiences, it's not like these identities just kind of add on to each other, but it in itself is different. It's a whole other thing. It's not like, you know, the interplay between those two identities, it just like amplifies what's already been, or magnifies what's already happening. No, it's like a whole different ball game. And I think when you think about like the erasure of Black women's voices, or just, you know, any marginalized person, the concept of voice versus listening, I think is very much relevant here, because, you know, just being given a microphone doesn't mean that you're being truly heard. And, you know, like having Ayo physically there for that interview doesn't mean that she was truly heard, and she wasn't, because that question wasn't even directed to her. So for whatever reason, that interviewer said, listen, I'm looking at you and I'm seeing what your identities are, and what you have to say isn't relevant to this question. And it just goes to show that, just because you're given a microphone, it doesn't mean that you're truly being heard. And the way that the system works, it often, you know, silences or distorts marginalized voices. And I think that erasure, it's painful for many reasons, but it's painful because it reinforces the power hierarchies. And, you know, the system is telling us who is legitimate to speak, whose voices should be heard, whose voices, need to be defended. It's painful because it perpetuates that invisibility. Like, because literally what happened was that a black woman was excluded from a question about Black Lives Matter and the Me Too. And that is just, you know, isn't the message that's being sent there, is that you are not being considered a legitimate person, or like your experiences or your identity is not considered legitimate enough to speak on this. It also reinforces the system by normalizing behavior like that. And this is why I think it's really important that we question the media that we consume, because if we don't question what we consume, the media is telling us like this is okay and this is normal. And I think this pattern of like just voices that are erased anyway, it shapes cultural memory, because if black women's contributions are routinely sidelined, well, future generations are going to miss out on historical truths. And so I think this erasure is it's painful on many, many levels. And, you know, you can argue that interview example, perhaps not that deep. And I have seen people say that online, because people were like, well, you know, Ayo still got to say what she had to say. But this interview is just a long list of, you can add it to the long list of instances where black women voices have been erased. And when you think about how painful this pattern is, there's a lot on the line. Like, imagine if like that interviewer did include Ayo into that question, and that question had been more inclusive and didn't erase marginalized voices. Can you imagine how that would have shifted the dynamics, how that moment would have pushed back on this pattern, how that question might have been answered differently, whose voices would have been prioritized in that moment. So, you know, you can argue that it's not that deep, but in my opinion, after breaking it down like this, it really is that deep. And I think another thing that I really wanted to unpack in this episode as well was, you know, I think, we've kind of spoken about the fact that Ayo was excluded from that question, but there was another key part of that question that I was like, hold up, let's rewind and let's really talk about that. So she said, what have we lost during the politically correct era? What have we lost during the politically correct era? Now, the way that this has been phrased, there is quite a few assumptions there. There is something to lose from quote-unquote political correctness. B, that political correctness has a coherent singular era. C, that the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement are done. D, that white, male, or non-black voices are the voices who are legitimate enough to judge what is lost or regained. And E, that a backlash or a quote-unquote return is underway. And let me say this again, that the exclusion of Ayo from this question suggests that the assumption that this question is not for someone who is most directly implicated by race and gender. So, before we get into unpacking this statement, what is political correctness? And I feel like political correctness is, often used in a way that speech norms that limit honesty or humor or authenticity. And so I feel like, I feel like the term has involved, it originally had leftist roots, meaning, strict ideological language control. And then especially as we the world becomes more extreme, I feel like PC has been adopted by the right wing as critique for oversensitivity or censorship. And so critics of PC, say it stifles free speech or humor or honest discourse. But then, on the other side of that spectrum is, actually PC calls out harmful language and calling that out is asking for accountability, not censorship. And so, I think the vibes behind that statement of what have we lost during the politically correct era is the vibes that it's giving is we have lost the ability to allow open discourse, and that progressiveness it's been done, it's overreached, and it's now prioritizing feelings over facts, and it's silencing voices. And I think the vibes of that statement, it dismisses the harms of language and structural violence in the system, and it silences marginalized voices. And I think just that statement, what have we lost during the politically correct era? Just a very small example of what's happening. And again, this is my 2 cents. If you're listening to this and you're like, yo, Amal, I kind of disagree with you, or I've got something to add to that, my inbox is always open, y'all. We can talk about it. But I just need to put this as a disclaimer. This is my 2 cents, okay? So, in recent years, especially in America and just across the world, there's this rhetoric of woke backlash, and that has become quite key to a lot of right-wing movements. And the story there is we can't say anything under more, we're living under cancel culture, and I think this story that is being told really is quite soothing to the identity politics that's happening on the right wing. And, that identity politics is very much saying I am under siege for speaking the truth, and free speech is threatened, and political correctness reigns. And I think the reason why like this story has been able to like let its freak flag fly high is because progressiveness has been portrayed as this like overly moralistic and authoritarian. Oh my gosh, my brain just broke for a second there. But yeah, I understand what I was trying to say. Or that it's like it's all about censorship. And I think when you think about the social movement as a pendulum, we've gone like this is how I would like outline it. I would say we're in our a PC era, and then that's led to a decline. And so now that there's this right-wing backlash, and then now we're returning to like quote-unquote authentic discourse, but this quote-unquote authentic discourse is, code for like conservative. And so and economically and socially, like when this framing is there, it allows the like elites to defend the status quo of these power structures by really, really pushing the story that progressiveness silences debate, rather than the people that were always silenced. And you've seen this in history, like any kind of social movement, there's always some kind of backlash. And you see this in our media and culture now. And it's interesting because the backlash to any kind of social movement, it's always like framed as some kind of loss, and like this loss is often the loss of like whatever community the system upholds or normalizes or has that power and that privilege. Like for example, one of the key losses that we keep hearing time and time again these days is like white males being like, oh gosh, like I can't even joke anymore. And again, it doesn't specifically have to be white males. I'm just saying white male because that the system of whiteness and then the system of the patriarchy, that's usually the identity that has the most power and privilege. But it could be like white females, it can be black males. You understand what I'm trying to say here? Like the system's intersectionality, the systems are at play. But you often hear like, oh gosh, like I can't joke anymore. I can't say the wrong thing. But when we're talking about these quote unquote losses, they're often just very small and modest gains in accountability and marginalized voices speaking up. So, yeah, it's interesting because I think, the question assumes that the era of progressiveness has, these costs, and these costs are often dominant voices feeling constrained because they can no longer say certain things without criticism, or now have to share space with marginalized voices. And I think it's interesting because that loss being mourned is not a universal thing. It's specific to those who had power and freedom to dominate the conversations before. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? When you break it down, you just think about the facts. When you think about the facts from that point of view, and I think when you get to this level as well, it just highlights even more so how wild that question is, because the exclusion of Ayo, the person most aligned with those identities, it just kind of reveals this hypocrisy, because if you truly believe that my brain keeps trying to combine movement and moment. But if you truly believe that a movement is done, you would ask those that are affected, not excluded them. So when you think about it like that, then it just seems like this story that this PC movement is a loss. It just reinforces that that's the energy that this interviewer was coming from. And yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. So what are the key takeaways from this episode? Voice and centering matter. Like framing and who is addressed and whose voices is being prioritized and heard are acts of power in itself. I think another lesson that we can take from here, exclusion is a signal. Like the interviewer was loud and clear when she said, this question is for Julia and Andrew alone. That exclusion sent a message, and it's, it's not just the interview about being rude. It's being, signaling who is seen as credible and who is not. This interview is just a drop in the ocean of, why these movements are not over, and the work must continue. But it just goes to show that these movements are not over. I think another golden nugget that we can take away from here is, we must always interrogate ourselves as to who gets asked, who gets heard, and why. And when I say this, I'm talking across multiple contexts, like our media, our culture, our institutions, even just in your own bubble that is your world, like your family, friends, what's happening at work. Always ask yourself, like, who gets asked, who gets heard, and why this happens. And I think the more we ask ourselves that, the more we'll be able to have honest conversations about our systems and how we interact with it and how it impacts our lives and how it impacts how we see this world. And I think it's really important, even more so now, that we ask ourselves this when we live in a world where there's just such extreme thinking and there is not a lot of dialogue at all. I think the skills of like having those uncomfortable discussions, there's no space for those skills to develop when we live in such a extreme world. And I think it's really important that we ask ourselves these questions. So, and some questions that I have after this kōrero is, how many times do we passively accept who is asked and who is silenced in interviews, panels, and meetings? And in your own workplace, whether it's your workplace, your friends, your family, social media, where have you seen and experienced this kind of inclusion? What can we do differently? And how should we hold institutions, interviewers, just anyone accountable without simply cancelling, but asking and insisting on better norms? And how can we develop our own personal relationship with the media that we consume to interrogate and ask those questions? Hopefully you've had lots of golden nuggets from this episode. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.